Okay, well, it's 4 o'clock, so why don't we get started? Let me welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is entitled Asia's Future is Now, How Asian Flows and Networks Are Defining the Next Phase of Globalization. My name is Ira Kasoff. I'm a member of the board of the Asia Society Southern California, and I'm pleased to facilitate today's webcast. I've spent more than 25 years living and working in Asia, mainly as a diplomat and also as a businessman. I also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Asia for 4 years under Presidents Bush and Obama, so I'm particularly interested in today's discussion. We're delighted to be cooperating with the McKinsey Global Institute on today's program. MGI is the business and economics research arm of McKinsey. It was established in 1990 to develop a deeper understanding of the evolving global economy. MGI's mission is to provide leaders in the commercial, public, and social sectors with the facts and insights on which to base management and policy decisions. Today's program is the first in a series that we at the Asia Society will be carrying out in partnership with MGI. One note before we begin today's program. If you have a question, you can type it in at any time using the Q&A button on your screen, and we will respond to as many questions as time permits following the presentation. Our speaker today will be Jeongmin Seong. Jeongmin is a partner at MGI. He leads MGI research teams in China working on global as well as China-focused themes. Jeongmin's recent research has focused on technology, innovation, and China's economic transition. Prior to joining MGI, Jeongmin worked with companies around the world focusing on consumer-facing industries as an associate partner at McKinsey's Greater China office. Prior to joining McKinsey, Jeongmin worked as a product marketing manager at Dell China. He is a graduate of the Harvard Business School where he received his MBA. Jeongmin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ira, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Frank and the Asia Society for this wonderful opportunity to share our knowledge on Asia. So this Future of Asia is our flagship campaign in Asia. So as Ira mentioned, we already released our first discussion paper on the flows and networks in Asia and how they are redefining the next phase of globalization last year. And we plan to publish at least 3 more research on Asia. So our second discussion paper will be about the performance of Asian companies, and our third paper will be about Asian technology landscape, and the fourth paper will be about the changing faces of Asian consumers. So if you are interested in these knowledges, stay tuned. And today, let me focus more on our first discussion paper on the Asian flows and network. So why do we pay so much attention to Asia, right? So that is simply because it matters, right? And if you look at what is happening in the world, right? So let's look at the United States, right? So the U.S. economy has been expanding over the past decade, right? Actually more than a decade, which is the new record, right? But then at the same time, there is a debate on an ongoing recession in the U.S. economy, and the inverted yield curve last year was perceived as a symptom of that. If you look at the European economy, right, so there's also a lot of uncertainties about Brexit, and also if you look at the German economy, it actually contracted in the second quarter, and it barely grew in the third quarter. And also European central banks, ECB, is also experimenting the negative interest rate. So again, there's a lot of uncertainties in the European economy, right? So given all this happening, where should we look to? Right? A sensible option is Asia. So let's talk more about Asia. And today, I brought 6 key messages for our discussion. And let me start with the first one. The arrival of Asian century. Basically, Asia is big. Asia is becoming more Asian, and Asia matters. So let me dive into the first message. Many people don't realize this, but Asia is already the largest economy in the world. It accounts for more than 40% of the global GDP. But also at the same time, if you look at lots of social indicators, you also see strong, upward trajectory in terms of life expectancy, and education or literacy rate, and so on. So overall, over the past decades, we see, rapid progress, right, in terms of economy and society in Asia. But then it's not just a big macroeconomic figures, and this progress has been affecting the lives of people, citizens in Asia. And let's look at some of this, right? So could you guess where this is? You can type up your response in the Q&A window. Where is this? Yep, I start seeing some answers. Yep, that's right. Oh, okay. So most of you got the right answer. Yes, this is so this is Shanghai. So this is Huangpu River, right? So this is the picture of Pudong area, which is a district in Shanghai back in 1990, and this is today, right? So you see a completely different picture, right? And if you look at the GDP of the Pudong district, right, it is already as large as the GDP of Hungary, for example, right? And it changed the lives of people in Shanghai. How about this? Another quiz. Where do you think this is? You can also type up your answers in the questions window. Yep, I start seeing some answer. Paul says South Korea, right? But then where in South Korea? Yep. So do you know the song Gangnam Style, right? So Psy, he's a up and coming and hot singer, right? So he sang a song called Gangnam Style. It became very hot. This is Gangnam, right? Back in 1960s and 70s, right? It was basically a rural area, right? And then this is today. So the biggest by the way, although I'm working in Shanghai in China, I am a Korean, and the biggest mistake that my parents made was not having both properties in Gangnam area. So again, transformational experience. Now, how about this? Any guess? Again, you can type up your answer in the questions window. Yeah, so this is a bit difficult. This is Jakarta back then and today, right? I can go on and on, right, with this kind of examples. Bangkok, Mumbai, and Singapore, and so on, right? So this is this is the magnitude of the change that we have been observing in Asia. And if you look at this trajectory, right? So we think that the trend is likely to continue. So by 2040, it is likely to be more than half of the global GDP. Right? So the weight that Asian economies will carry is likely to be larger. But then these are just big macroeconomic figures, right? So what does that mean? What's the implication? Right? And we think that one of big message is that Asia is becoming more Asian, and we went beyond these big macroeconomic figures and analyzed what is happening in terms of the flows and networks across these 8 dimensions and 16 flows, and basically found out that Asia is becoming bigger and becoming more Asian. And let me elaborate that a bit more, right? So if you look at the share of Asia in these types of flows, in these 16 flows, Asia has been becoming bigger, right? So if you look at the share of trade, Asia accounts for about 1/3 of the global trade, about 40 to 50% of the people flows, 65% of the patent application in terms of knowledge, and again 60 to 70% of the global transportation flows, right? So so across across many of these dimensions, right? So with the exception of one, Asia is becoming bigger, and let me get back to that one dimension, which is about environment a bit later. So on the one hand, Asia is becoming big, and then on the other hand, Asia is becoming more Asian. So let me, I should be able to erase this.
If you go to annotate and click on clear, that's going to be what you need in order to erase that.
Great, clear all drawings. Great, thank you. Yes, so if you look at what is happening in those flows, right? First of all, Asia is becoming bigger, and at the same time, Asia is becoming more Asian. So about 60% of the trade flows and capital flows are actually happening on an intra-regional basis. 70% of the startup funding and 74% of the people flows are actually happening on an intra-regional basis, right? So we see very strong tendency of this intra-regional connectivity, right? And so again, Asia is becoming big and simply becoming more Asian. And this is one flow that actually declined, right? So which is against the overall trend. So this is about waste, right? So last year, China announced the ban of the waste flows, right? The plastic waste, and many other countries in Asia actually, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines followed the similar move, right? So therefore, if you look at the flows of this waste, it has been actually, so Asia accounts for 71% of the global imports of waste, and it is on the declining trajectory. So and that is because the sustainability in Asia is becoming quite an important issue, and this also disrupted the flows of a global waste value chain. So if you are in a relevant industry, right? So there could be more disruption coming up in the future. So that was the first message, the arrival of Asian centuries. Asia is becoming more Asian. Then let me move on to the second message about decoding the Asia. So Asia is big, right? And let me ask a question. How many languages are spoken in Asia? There is also raise hand function. So if you think it's about 500, then raise your hand. 1,000, raise your hand. More than 2,000, raise your hand. Yeah, so it is great. So many of you got this right. So it's actually more than 2,000, right? And also, let me ask another question. What will be the gap in terms of per capita GDP between the Nepal and the Singapore? If you think there is a 10x gap, please raise your hand. 20x, raise your hand. 50 times. More than 60 times? Okay, so it is actually more than 60 times, right? So there are 4 billion people living in Asia, speaking more than 2,000 different languages, right? And there is a massive gap in terms of the living standard and economic progress. So what is Asia, right? And some people even say that the notion of Asia, the concept of Asia is invented by the West, right? So and there is no such a thing called Asia, right? So our view is that still there is a way to define Asia, and we think that there are at least 4 different Asia. The first type of Asia is called advanced Asia. They are a lot more advanced in terms of economic progress, and they provide capital and technology to the other region. For example, Japan, Korea, Singapore will be part of this advanced Asian segment. Second segment will be China, right? Given its sheer scale and the role that it plays as an anchor economy or connectivity platform, China can be treated as another segment of Asia. Third, Asia is called emerging Asia. So they are still emerging in terms of economic development. And at the same time, they are heavily integrated with other parts of Asia. For example, many economies in Southeast Asia could be categorized as this emerging Asia. And fourth, Asia can be India and frontier Asia, right? So they are also in the rapidly growing stage, but then they are not so much integrated with the rest of Asia. So we think that there could be these 4 different Asia, and these 4 Asias are becoming larger, right? And in fact, they are likely to be as large as the continents, right? In different regions, right? For example, advanced Asia, may be larger than the Middle East and Africa. China could be as big as North America, and emerging Asia could be comparable to the Latin America. So we think that many companies think that the Latin American strategy, Africa strategy, Middle East strategy, and North American strategy matter. But in fact, right, so you'll see combination of those continents in Asia, right? So in short, Asia matters, right? So again, this is reinforcing our first message. And, this is how we thought about defining 4 different Asias, right? So we took 3 lenses, right? So in terms of scale, China is way bigger than the other countries and other geographies. That sets China apart. In terms of economic development, advanced Asia is quite different from other geography, and that sets advanced Asia as a different segment. And the interaction with the world, right, in terms of people flow, capital flow, and trade flow, that differentiates emerging Asia from frontier Asia. So emerging Asia, they are heavily integrated with other parts of Asia. For example, 70 to 80% of their people, trade capital flows are happening on an intra-regional basis. Whereas India and frontier Asia, they are not so much integrated. Only about 30% of those flows are happening on an intra-regional basis. So this is how we define, 4 different Asia. And one very important and interesting finding is that these 4 different Asias are actually quite complementary to each other. Right? So for example, if you take the lens of growth, right? So advanced Asia is likely to experience very slow growth, right, over the coming decade, maybe around 1 to 2% growth per year, whereas the 3 other Asias can contribute quite rapid growth, right, perhaps growing at 4 to 6%. So this 3 Asias can become an attractive growth engine, a growth opportunity for advanced Asia. So if you look at the labor dimension, advanced Asia and China are declining, are experiencing declining working age population, right? So the shrinking supply of labor force, whereas in emerging Asia and frontier Asia, they still enjoy so-called demographic dividend and rapid urbanization. In terms of capital flows, advanced Asia and China are becoming a big outbound investors, whereas emerging Asia and frontier Asia, they are the recipients of this foreign direct investment flows, right? So, across those economic dimensions, these 4 different Asias are quite complementary, and this creates incentive for this the Asian economies to collaborate more together. So that was our second message. There's no one Asia, but 4, and then they are quite complementary. And what does that mean, right? So this, complementary characteristics of different Asias are generating interesting and new networks and flows across Asia. And in our research report, we highlighted three types of networks. The first type is called industrialization, and second type is innovation network, and third is culture and mobility network. And then let me elaborate more on those networks. So let's talk about the industrialization network. One interesting phenomenon is that there is a shift in terms of value chain from China to the rest of the Asia, especially emerging and frontier Asia, and this is happening independent of the global trade dispute. Right? So as Chinese economy is moving up the value chain and then upgrading from labor intensive to knowledge intensive sectors, they are gradually losing their shares in labor intensive manufacturing, and this is an analysis of the share of these emerging economies out of the labor intensive manufacturing exports. And if you look at China, the share actually declined by 3 percentage points over the past 3 years, and all of these gaps were filled by other Asian economies like Vietnam and Cambodia and so on and so on. So one interesting observation on this industrialization network is a shift between China and the rest of the emerging economy. And another interesting observation is a new corridor getting established between advanced Asia and also other economies. This is an example of Vietnam and Korean corridor. So Vietnam is becoming a powerhouse in terms of electronics exports, and that is partly enabled and facilitated by South Korea. So about 80% of FDI influence in the electronics sector in Vietnam actually came from South Korea, and about a third of Vietnam's export is actually computers and electronic products. So this is another interesting corridor, right? And this kind of shift is creating lots of new industrialization hubs across Asia, and here is an example of this top 50 fastest rising cities in terms of this industrialization network. And of course, there are already well-known cities, such as Shenzhen and Dongguan, right, and Guangzhou, right? So which has been playing the role of factory of the world. But at the same time, there are lesser known cities rising across Asia, which could be the next investment destination for manufacturing companies, right? So for example, if you think of Vietnam, the Hanoi, right, is a most well-known city, but but Haiphong, which is lesser known, is becoming an electronics and hub, right, in Vietnam. If you think about Jakarta, Indonesia, Jakarta is the most known city, but at the same time, Bekasi is becoming a Detroit of Indonesia. If you think about India, right? So Delhi and Mumbai are well-known cities, but Jamnagar is becoming an old city of Indonesia. So lots and lots of this interesting and new hubs are emerging because of the new flows and networks are getting formed across Asia. So that was the industrialization hub, and let me move on to the innovation hub. Right? So Asia is becoming a powerhouse in the technology landscape as well, right? So if you look at top 10, global tech companies, they were known from Asia about 10 years ago, right? But today, there are 4. And also if you look at the unicorns, right? About 36% of the unicorns are incubated in Asia. So if you look at the digital landscape across Asia, it is very active and very dynamic, and we think that so-called multi-local innovation networks are emerging. And what do we mean by that, right? So we think that the nature of the innovation is local, right? So and as you see the name of these companies on this chart, a lot of them are local, right? So these are local brands across multiple sectors, right? In mobility, e-commerce, and payments, and also a lot of them were founded by the local entrepreneurs because they need to navigate the complex local regulatory environment and meet the diverse local demand, right? So in that sense, innovation is local, but at the same time, it is also multi. Right? So if you look at the inspiration of this business model, they are largely coming from other leading geography in the region, especially China. And then also, if you look at the funding behind this startups and digital companies, a lot of them are coming from Asia. So we think that about 70% of Asian startup fundings are actually coming from Asia. So in short, Asia is funding its own innovation, right? So this interesting innovation networks and flows are emerging in Asia, and then again, that makes lots of Asian cities becoming the next generation of innovation hub in the world. Let me move on to the third network emerging in Asia, which is culture and mobility. So Asia used to be the recipient of the Western culture, and when I was young, I was a big fan of Rocky and Rambo, right? And Sylvester Stallone was my hero, right? But then today, Asia is becoming a growing hub for culture and start creating its own blockbuster. And this is an example. So could you guess who they are? You can type up your answer in the Q&A window. So if you have a teenage daughter, you must have heard of them. So they are, so Paul got it right. So they are BTS, Bangtan Sonyeondan, right? So they are the next Beatles. So when Beatles became hot and went to the US, people called it British invasion. There's Korean invasion now, right? And this boy band, they are breaking the world record, and they're on the Guinness Book, at least in three areas. Right? But then it's not just this Korean boy band and Korean invasion. There could be China invasion, Indonesia invasion, Singapore invasion in the future. How about this? Could you guess what this program is about? Or who they are? Does anyone recognize who they are, the actor and actress? Okay. So this is a TV drama called Mr. Sunshine. It's a Korean TV drama, and Netflix invested in this, and they were aired in Korea as well as through the Netflix network. So they were able to reach the global audience, and in fact, Netflix is trying to capitalize on the growth trend, right, in Asia, in the culture area, and they also invested in the original content creation in Indonesia as well. How about this? What are they doing? So so you can, so they are actually doing yoga. So this is a yoga festival in Singapore. So yoga is originated out of India, but it's a global phenomenon, right? It became a global phenomenon, and in India, in fact, the Bollywood, in fact, is producing about 1,800 movies per year, right? So becoming another powerhouse in terms of the culture. So So lots and lots of interesting cultural networks are emerging, and a lot of that is enabled by the people flows in Asia. Right? So if you look at the people on the move, the travelers volume in Asia over the past decade, the intra-regional travelers grew 2.7 times versus 1.8 times global travelers. So it is growing much faster. And it is likely to become even bigger, right? And this is the picture of the Great Wall in China on one of those holidays, right? So basically, so in China, right? So you can go to this hot tourist destination during the holidays because you'll see lots and lots of people, and you end up spending your time lining up, right? So this means that there'll be greater people flow, right? So outbound people flow from China as well in the future, especially as the incomes rise, right? And they may redefine the standard of travel industry and facilitate the related industries in hospitality, retail, finance, and construction. So if you are in the related sectors, that can be a big opportunity as well. And finally, let me briefly touch upon the other implications of this trend. What does that mean to the digital makers around the world? First, we need to be Asia relevant, right? So we talked about the rising scale and influence of Asia, right? So in the flows where Asia is already big, you just need to be part of it, right? In order to capitalize on those trends. In the flows where Asia is not so big yet and still dependent on the other global flows, we'll need to think about how to continue to offer competitive and relevant products and services so that we can meet the rising demand in Asia. Right? So that's the first implication. Second implication is rethinking the Asian operating model. So the economic growth is likely to continue, and if that happens, these 4 different Asia could be as large as the individual continents. Right? But then at the same time, Asia is very diverse, right? So therefore, we'll need to take a granular view in terms of how to manage Asia, right? So how to grow in Asia and do more businesses in Asia. So Asia is not a region that you can manage from a distance. Right? From a single headquarter in Hong Kong or Singapore. So that's the second implication. Third implication is about the risks, right? So Asia. So there are many challenges that Asia also needs to overcome, right? For example, sustainability, right? So if the 45 out of 50 most polluted cities in the world are in Asia, right? And as middle class is rising, they pay attention to this issue. And also skills gap need to be filled, right? So if, especially the emerging and frontier Asian countries, if they want to benefit from the value chain shift from China or from advanced Asia, they need to train their people. And also at the same time, these countries need to improve their institutional capabilities in order to facilitate more productive resource allocation, and also address the corruption issues as well. The fourth implication is about forging a stronger intra-regional collaboration. Right? So given the geopolitical uncertainties, there could be a greater incentive to collaborate with each other. But then the scope of collaboration can go way beyond trade. Right? So it can include data flows, people flows, capital flows, and knowledge flows. And also think about dispute resolution system, right? Because Asia is also not a region without this geopolitical tension. So it'll be important to think about how to forge this stronger collaboration networks and framework. So that was my presentation for the day. And if you are interested in more details, you can actually download our report from our website. Thank you, and happy to take some of the questions as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeongmin. That was a terrific presentation, very informative. So as I mentioned at the outset, some of you may not have joined at that time. If you have questions, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can type in your questions, and we'll get to as many as time permits. And while people are typing in questions, let me kick it off with one or two. So Jeongmin, I don't know what you think about the impact of the current political environment, particularly U.S.-China tensions, and how that has been affecting the dynamics that you've been talking about in this study. Is the trade war, for example, accelerating Asian countries' dependence on each other?
Yeah, so that's an important question, Ira, right? So this the uncertainties around this geopolitical situation can create stronger incentives for Asian countries to collaborate with each other, right? So there is geographic proximity and also complementary characteristics as we discussed, right? So therefore as a policymaker and as a business executives, they will have more incentives and more opportunities to explore in the region, and especially if you look at the portfolio of China, right? So actually 50 to 55% of the export and import are already with the other Asian economies, and the share with the US is so the export to the US is less than 20% of the total export, and then import is about 6 to 7%. So there's already a strong tendency and connectivity and pivot toward the Asian countries with each other.
Thank you. So I see we're starting to get a couple of questions. I have a few more, but let me turn to a couple from participants. David Carl asked, what is the most consequential trend underway in Asia that has not received the attention it deserves? That's kind of a tricky question, because if we haven't paid it attention, we probably aren't aware of it. But let me make a couple of comments, and then Jeongmin, see what you think if you want to add something. I think that just the content of this presentation, to me, is extremely consequential and probably has not received much attention. Just how big and how important intra-Asian trade and commerce and travel and so forth has grown, particularly for someone who I first lived in Asia in 1973, and I've been back and forth, as I mentioned, many years, lived there for over 25 years since then. To see where Asia is now, as Jeongmin just portrayed it, is quite astounding. And he mentioned, for example, the large share of global consumption that Asian countries are now occupying will grow to 40% by 2040. Traditionally, the countries in Asia have been manufacturers, not big consumers. We in Western Europe, the advanced countries, have been the big consumers. 60% of patents filed are coming from Asian countries. These, to me, are just remarkable numbers. So those are my quick thoughts. Jeongmin, you have anything to add on that question?
Yeah, so I think, so the scale is definitely one, and then also the nature of these complementary characteristics, right? So that was also an interesting and surprising findings from our research, and also we shared with various audience, and they also didn't realize that, right? And then also, to your point, Ira, so Asia has been factory of the world, right? But then many people do not understand how Asia is also rising in terms of innovation and also cultural landscape. Right? So that is another consequential trend that deserves more attention from the world.
Yeah, I agree. So one more. This one is very specifically for you, Jeongmin. I guess you can see it, but I don't know if other participants can see it. So I will read it. As you gathered and shifted through the data for the report, did any surprises emerge or anything that cuts against the conventional wisdom?
Yeah, so I think this is similar to the answer that I just shared, right? So the conventional wisdom is that, hey, Asia, cheap labor, all right, and factory of the world, so lots of industrialization zones happening in Asia, right? But at the same time, Asia has enough scale and contents and flows, right, to generate its own cultural blockbusters. And also, Asia is becoming a powerhouse in terms of technology, right? So, for example, China is already a global leader in terms of digital innovation, and also many of the other consumer-facing categories, such as smartphones and electronics and so on. And this and also in many other parts of the Asia, right, especially Southeast Asia and India, right. So they are, so in terms of the pace of the digitization of these economies, they are the fastest in the world, right. So Asia is likely to increasingly become the innovation leader, especially in the digital space as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so far we're not getting more questions from participants. So I have another one that is kind of a slightly deeper dive on my first question, which is that despite the trade war and the US imposition of very stiff tariffs on Chinese imports, China's export of goods to the US looked like they fell in 2019 by only around 15%. I say look like because the final 2019 numbers are not in yet, but through November anyway, that's the trend. And China's overall exports did not fall as exports to the rest of the world increased to compensate for the fall in exports to the US. So I think there are several possible factors for this, or at least several occur to me. Depreciation. Secondly, routing exports to the United States through other countries to avoid the higher US tariffs on Chinese exports. And third, no longer just serving as the final assembly point, but producing more of the inputs that go into those exports. So do you have any thoughts on the importance of these factors or perhaps others and how they might be affecting intra-regional trade?
Yeah, I think all of those are sensible explanations and plausible factors behind this. So the export to US declined, but export to Europe and Asia and other parts of the world have increased, and that offset the impact of the decline of export to the US. Right? And the US, the trade with US is not as big as many think. Right? So it's less than 20% of the, and it's 7 to 8% or 6 to 8% of the other import. Right? So that's one factor. And then also another factor that I would like to mention is that China is not that trade dependent in fact, right? So the contribution of net trade to China's GDP growth was actually negative in 2018. Right? So 60 to 70% of the GDP growth in China is actually coming from its own people, i.e., consumption. Right? So that's why, despite all the noise about this trade dispute and so on, we don't see a material impact on the macroeconomic growth overall yet.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think the Trump administration has overestimated the impact of these tariffs on China. There's been a lot of talk about how China's economy is hurting and it's slowing. And it is slowing, but it's still over 6% GDP growth, which is quite substantial. And as you've just talked about, China's overall exports have not declined, even though exports to the US have declined. And China is not as trade dependent as it used to be. So I think the administration does not have as much leverage as they thought they did on China. So we have a question from one of the participants. What is your view on the future trend of regional operations? Any challenges you see for companies continuing to operate regional headquarters in Hong Kong or Singapore? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a great and very challenging question, right? So so Asia is big, right? So Asia will account for half of global GDP. So it'll be very difficult to manage from a single headquarter in a specific location. Right? And then also, even within China, we think that there's no China strategy, right? So we can divide China into 15, 20 different clusters. Therefore, and also each cluster is different, right? So So therefore, in our view is that, you know, taking a more granular view to win in Asia will increasingly matter. You know, even taking a city view or city cluster view will be extremely important, right? And also at the same time, you know, how to scale your business across different countries, right? Especially in the geography such as Southeast Asia will be also another big challenge, right? So Southeast Asia, you know, as an economic bloc, is becoming big, right? But then, you know, the language is different, you know, culture is different, economic development status is different, right? So therefore, you know, how to scale your business, you know, across different countries will be another question. You know, therefore, you know, you will need a strong local team and local talent and empowerment of those team, right, in order for them to, you know, deal with this you know, different local situations and changing environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because as you quite rightly point out, so many of these countries in Asia are developing very rapidly, and so many cities and regions. It's I think harder to think about having one regional headquarters for all of Asia, and then on top of that, you have the political situation in Hong Kong, which is giving a lot of companies pause in terms of thinking about having their senior executives based in Hong Kong. So I think that those are important trends that are going on right now. So we have a few more questions here. The next one is, given the developments in Asia, how do you see the future implications on global supply chains?
Yeah, so first of all, you know, we think that the next phase of globalization is regionalization, right? So you know, there is a very strong tendency of this making supply chains shorter and stay close to the market, right? And then in Asia, you know, we are already seeing that, right? So there's stronger, you know, intra-regional flows and connectivity, right? So therefore, how to build your regional supply chains will matter. And then, you know, second trend is the shift, right? So from, you know, China to other developing economies, and from advanced Asia to other, you know, developing economies in Asia, right? So how do you benefit from that shift and utilize that, right? So to your speed and cost advantage, right? So that'll be important consideration in terms of designing the future supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another one. Do you think that political stability will become a more significant issue for Asia as a whole in the future, or will it remain confined to places like Hong Kong?
It is, right? So it is important. So it's in general, right? So you know, businesses don't like uncertainties and volatilities, right? So therefore, the infrastructure, the institutional capabilities to ensure the stability in any economy will matter, right? Because, you know, only when you have confidence in certain economies, you make a long-term investment, right? So therefore, the stability of the economy will be matter, not just in Hong Kong, but across Asia as well.
Mm-hmm. And of course, closer to home for you, we have the potential for instability always on the Korean Peninsula. Hopefully it will remain stable, but that's always a concern.
Yeah.
Here's one for you, Jeongmin. Based on the companies you deal with, do you think U.S. businesses truly understand emerging opportunities and risks in Asia in terms of consumer trends, political risk, and regional trade dynamics? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I think you know, there'll be a big spectrum of companies, right? So the leading, you know, global U.S. or multinational companies, yes, you know, definitely, right? So you know, that's why, you know, despite this you know, geopolitical tension, if you look at the other surveys of the other American companies or European companies, you know, done by, you know, chambers of America or Europe, you know, they still, the huge majority of them think that, you know, China is still the top 3 priority in terms of the global investment. Right? And then, some of these companies are winning in China, right? So like, Nike, Disneyland, Starbucks, right? And then also lots of, German, car makers, they are generating, lots of revenue and profits in China. And then, some of the companies are actually moving their headquarters to China, for example, right? It's, some business units, right? So in that sense, this leading businesses, they are fully aware of these trends and also at the same time the risks and regional dynamics as well. But then still, many of the businesses, right, who didn't have capacity to think about their global strategy and trying to manage the Asian business remotely, they don't understand this, right? And also that's one of the reasons we have launched this flagship campaign on the future of Asia.
Mm-hmm. So there's a question in the chat section, which I will go ahead and read. How will the Asia sector, I think Asia region, create massive numbers of jobs that will devolve from AI and virtual production? In other words, that will be lost because of AI and virtual production. Vast unemployment requires the creation of new jobs for non-market driven economies. Are any governments or businesses attending to transformational employment?
Yeah, so first of all, right, so the challenge from this AI and automation could be less in Asia, because in the labor market, there's a lot of tailwind in Asia, right? So it'll be a rapid growth environment, and there'll be continuous urbanization happening in Asia. And also the development of service sectors, right, which has more potential to create jobs, right? So therefore, in terms of the shock, the degree of shock and the degree of job loss in Asia could be less than the other advanced economies. And also, in terms of economics, right? So it doesn't make sense to automate all those low cost jobs. In that sense, Asia is in a better position, but at the same time, Asia needs to step up, right? So they need to capitalize on the trend from this new, technological development, right? So therefore, creating the right capacity of talent will be critical to drive the innovation and productivity that is needed in Asia. And countries like China is making a big bet on the digital transformation and AI, and you'll see similar trends in Korea, focusing on fourth industrial revolution. In Singapore, facilitating more environment to create startups and digital ecosystem as well.
All right, I don't see any more questions. We're almost at the end of the hour, so. Let me first thank Jeongmin for a terrific presentation and terrific Q&A. This was a bit of an experiment for us using this webinar format. Since we're based in LA and traffic is such a major consideration, this is something that we want to do more of. And I think it worked quite well. So I want to thank all of our participants for listening in and for submitting questions. And hopefully you will join us for the next one. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.